Hey guys, it's Mike here, and I just saw It Chapter 2, which is the part 2 and sequel to the 2017 remake and adaptation of Stephen King's novel. Now, like most kids growing up in the 90s, my original exposure to the It story came in the form of the miniseries starring Tim Curry as Pennywise, as well as a number of prominent child actors. And I remember liking it, although it definitely wasn't my favorite Stephen King adaptation at the time. And honestly, not much of it really stuck with me over the years. Aside from the general concept of it, some of the bigger moments and scares, and of course, Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise. Although I would say it was more funny than scary for me as a kid. And honestly, I found other Stephen King adaptations, like Rose Red and The Shining, to be far more frightening than It. After that point, I went on to read much of the book, although it was so long and kind of all over the place that I wasn't really that big of a fan. And honestly, it's probably not one of my favorite Stephen King works, although I definitely understand the cultural significance it had and the influence it had on other writers and filmmakers after he released it. With that being said, when the 2017 It came out, I wasn't really that excited to see it. So I skipped seeing it in theaters and waited until it came out on home release so I could watch it. And honestly, I didn't think it was anywhere near as good as a lot of people made it out to be. Now, there were some interesting concepts in the film just like there were in the novel, and I would have to say that the child actors did a really good job for the most part, although I'm not too sure I would say that's quite on the level of Stranger Things, which is a little ironic considering that at least one of them actually was in Stranger Things, with that being Finn Wolfhard, and I feel like he was kind of underused in that film as well. But for the most part, I didn't really think the film was that scary. Sure, you had a great performance by Bill Skarsgård playing Pennywise, and you definitely had some disturbing imagery and creepy moments, but the film had too many tonal inconsistencies as far as comedy and horror were concerned. When you're trying to create a very strong and compelling horror story, throwing in things that are borderline wacky and over-the-top comedic doesn't really help that tone and air of suspense, so my viewing experience of the film concluded with me being kind of disappointed. So the prospect of them breaking this up into two different films, with the second part once again being about the adults, much like the TV miniseries, wasn't really something I was looking forward to, especially when I remembered that the second part of the TV miniseries was actually the worst one. I'm sure everyone remembers how that went down. However, when I saw the casting of the adult versions of the children, including actors such as James McAvoy, Jessica Chastain, and Bill Hader, I became a lot more interested. And while I thought the first trailer was kind of bad, the second one made it seem like this was going to be a lot better, and was going to be a significant improvement on the original adaptation. So going into this movie, I had a slight amount of hope. And naturally, that ended up just being hopeless optimism. Because while this one might be better than the original part 2 of the miniseries, that's not really saying too much. Now, the story of It Chapter 2 takes place 27 years after the first movie, in which the group of kids, the Losers Club, have now grown up and moved away from Derry. At this point, almost all of them have forgotten what happened during their fight against Pennywise. All of them, save for Mike, played by Isaiah Mustafa. When Pennywise finally resurfaces and begins feeding on the residents once again, the Losers Club must come back together and remember what happened to them years ago, so that they can put an end to Pennywise once and for all. Now let me first discuss some of the things that this film did well. Now first up, I would have to say that the casting here was really well done. The actors who play the grown-up versions of the kids from the first part not only look like them, but do a great job of emulating their characteristics from part 1. Now James McAvoy as Bill is great as always, and he's shown to be a really talented actor with many of the roles that he's played in recent years. In this film, he basically plays the Stephen King analog, being a writer, in this case for films, who in a meta-reference to Stephen King is pretty bad at writing ends to his stories. Jessica Chastain is also good as the grown-up version of Beverly, and she's been proven to be a really good actress in films in the past, although her performances definitely go up and down depending upon what she's cast in, such as the most recent film that she shared with James McAvoy, X-Men Dark Phoenix, which is arguably the worst of the entire franchise. However, when it comes to a show-stealing actor, I would have to say that that role might have come down to Bill Hader playing Richie, the grown-up version of Finn Wolfhard's character from It Chapter 1, as he does a great job playing this more layered character who probably gets the most development out of all the characters in the film. And he's able to go from comedic to serious pretty much instantly when the film requires it. And he has a lot of funny lines throughout. And of course, I would have to mention Bill Skarsgård once again playing Pennywise, because he gives a great performance just like he did in the first part, being able to go from scary to comedic at the drop of a hat. Although that's certainly something that happens quite a bit, as I'll be getting into soon. And after all, this is a horror film, and there are a few decent scares along the way, I would have to say. Some of them which take place in the present time, and some of them which are shown in flashbacks in the past. Naturally including some disturbing and creepy imagery, again much like the first film. Although I would say that it's not necessarily done as well here. But overall, I think the best compliment I could give this film is that it's better than the original Part 2 from the miniseries, with I think the biggest improvements being the acting, with the cast being much better in this version, as well as the cinematography, because there definitely are some really nice looking shots and some cool moments that happen throughout the film, while the original, being something that was created for TV, had far less dynamic cinematography and lighting, which definitely helps it a little bit in my eyes. Although I would have to say that those are pretty much the only compliments I can give this film. And I have to now jump into some of the things that weren't really well done. And I'll start with the biggest problem I have with this film, which is the tonal consistency of it. Now, much like in the first film, the tone was all over the place here, as it would jump from horror to comedy pretty much instantaneously. And it really kind of suffered from Iron Man 3 syndrome here, where pretty much every single time there would be a serious moment or a big scare, they would instantly jump into comedy, which would completely diffuse all of the tension and the scare that was just built up to. And I really don't understand why they did this, especially as often as they did. Because when you're trying to create a horror film, even if it's something that's kind of wacky, the goal of the writers as well as the director should be to maintain that level of tension and scariness throughout. Much like another Stephen King film like The Shining. However, that had the benefit of being directed by Stanley Kubrick. But this constantly happened throughout the entire film to where I couldn't really get invested in any of the frightening moments, save for a handful. And even then, a lot of this was hampered by the fact that the film was way too long. Like, despite the fact that this film actually has less of a story than Part 1, it ended up being nearly 3 hours in length. And of course, the original Stephen King novel is extremely lengthy compared to what you would expect for this sort of story. But when it comes to the film adaptation, you definitely didn't need all of these scenes of people just standing around or sitting around and talking. And this especially happened in the first and second act, where there were so many scenes that I feel like they could have cut out, either because they weren't really introducing new information, or that information didn't need to take up anywhere near as much time as it did. Like for me, there's at least 20 plus minutes worth of scenes that they could have just left on the cutting room floor without missing anything at all. And some of this also comes down to subplots that were completely pointless, such as one that involved the bully from the original film. And while a number of these things did happen in the original book, considering how this film barely fleshed them out, they pretty much amounted to nothing here, other than just padding out the runtime. And the thing is too that it's not like this film was completely faithful to the original novel either. There's like a whole other subplot with the character Mike that's added to this film that didn't even exist in the original or the TV miniseries. And I feel like maybe that was in part done so that they could try and explain more about how Pennywise came to the planet and how he threatened the world before the story of it even really started. But they did it in a glorified, underexplained montage. And there was so much explaining from the actual novel, including a whole other cosmic being that they completely cut out here. So I feel like if you're going to have so many scenes of the characters standing around and talking, and then you add in a whole other subplot that wasn't even in the original novel, so you can kind of try and explain this, then they should have just gone full in and explained it as well as the other more cosmic stuff surrounding it, just like they did in the novel. But they really don't here, and it's kind of baffling as to why, as well as many of the other decisions that they made throughout. In addition to that, when they originally originally pitched that this was going to be in 2 different parts, they made it seem like this film was going to be only focusing on the adult portions of the story. Because in the original novel, the story would go back and forth between the adults and the children. And unfortunately, they also did a lot of that here, showing tons of flashbacks to scenes of things that didn't even happen in the original movie. And retconning certain events a little bit just so that they can add in even more scares that ultimately were tensionless because of the fact that we already knew the children would survive into this film and become adults. And I feel like these flashbacks additionally helped to bog down the movie. Because a lot of the stuff with the adults is kind of underdeveloped and uninteresting, and too much focus is happening on things that already took place decades before in the story, which all ties into this idea of them remembering what happened before, and I feel like all of this could have been easily streamlined, without losing much at all, which I feel like is symptomatic of the entire film. Aside from that, you have the typical horror trappings that we see in most horror movies nowadays that make me generally not even like modern horror movies, such as jump scares and the overuse of CGI, such as the different forms that Pennywise takes on over the course of the movie. And even for some of the flashbacks, they digitally de-aged some of the characters, which I feel like was completely pointless since he could have just cut out a lot of those flashbacks without even losing anything. And then you have the typical cliches of the characters splitting up, and of course a modern horror movie wouldn't be complete without jump scares, where the sound is always turned down all the way, or they put on the generic tension building music in the background, and then they have a fake out and the character then turns around and something jumps right at them, which maybe if you're a kid you might find scary, but as an adult I definitely don't. And the less we see of jump scares in future horror movies, the better in my eyes, because they're just done to death at this point. They might as well just call them jump startles, because that's literally all that's happening during them. So overall, It Chapter 2 is a pretty underwhelming horror movie. It's definitely better than part 2 of the miniseries, but it's a clear step down from It 2017. And in many ways, this film symbolizes the issues that I have with modern horror movies, which is why I barely even see them anymore. As far as a rating goes, I'd probably give It Chapter 1 a 6 to a 7 out of 10, whereas with this one, I'd probably give it a 5 to a 6. And I think I'll settle on a 6 for now. And that's pretty much because of the acting, some of the cinematography, and a few sequences I did like. As far as a recommendation goes, it's definitely not a movie I think you need to see in theaters right now. I mean, maybe if you really love the novel and the It remake from 2017, and you just want to see where the story ends. But much like with that movie and now this one, I feel like you should probably just wait until it's out on Blu-ray or streaming. You're not really missing out on much by not seeing it in theaters. And even then, there's plenty of better horror movies you could be watching right now on streaming or on Blu-ray. Same goes for other Stephen King adaptations like The Shining or The Mist. Alright guys, so if you've seen It Chapter 2, let me know your own thoughts down below. Also, if you're new to this channel, then make sure to subscribe and enable notifications so that you can see all of my videos right away when they come out. And make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.